Hello everyone, George here, and we're back again with another episode of the WarSaw project. This represents work that was completed anywhere between 1 and 2 weeks ago. This is right before we were going to show our first demonstration of the work that our team has actually put together. And by team, this is actually being run in several different areas in our university. The first one is as a clinic project. Clinic is an engineering course, 2-credit course that's every Tuesday and Thursday. And students in there have been assisting me in putting this entire thing together. In addition to that, it's grown into several other courses, but none of that work has actually happened yet. It's just going to begin next week. What you're seeing here is I'm trying to start to fill up the different space with different objects. The whole area just seems blank and empty. Those are curtains that one of the students made inside a blender using some of the physics. He actually did a pretty good job putting this together for us. The only thing that's missing right now are any kind of rings or like a shaft that goes through the top of it. What I'm trying to do right now is bring it to life, adding some see-through substance, cloth type materials to it because I want it to be more like a lace. Of course, I'm trying to add a little bit of variation to it by messing with, of course, just a rust layer on top of that and then turning that to a color that makes more sense and really dialing that down. Because once again, I'm still on the mindset that I'm trying not to make things too dirty in this case. It is a place that's constantly used. Here I'm making a bottle. One of the things that seemed to be on shelves in several of the different photos were dark glass bottles used to hold different things. So I'm creating one right here. Now you're probably going to notice me not going as fast as usual, even though this is sped up around 800 times. That's because I'm actually in class at this time. And class isn't class like the sense of I'm instructing students. Everyone's working towards the goal of the project, but I'm doing this in front of them to kind of show how things are supposed to be done, as well as answer questions on Blender, Maya, Unity, and how to do different things. So I'm kind of, split into 3 different modes at the same time, so I'm a little slower than usual. Here, bringing in the assets that one of the students brought in and trying to see if they work. They made a apron, the curtain, a kitchen desk element, and then a small kind of, side desk type thing. At this time, the apron is just too much the same thing, if duplicated. So you'll notice it kind of looks awkward there in that spot. So I've asked that student to go through and make several variations of that curtain, and also maybe make it so it's not quite falling the same way. It looks kind of wrong. I'm also going through and adjusting the scale and the size of the different rooms. And this is something that I'm going to actually completely change by the end of the video, is how I build the rooms. Right now you'll notice they're planes, and one side of them is completely, well, not transparent, but the winding order on it is making it so that there's no visibility on one side of it. Because of that, the lighting shines right through, and it's actually causing a lot of issues with how I'm going to bake the lights. You'll notice that I have to put these barriers all around the different elements. And those barriers become a giant pain in the butt when the geometry becomes very complicated, such as around the window elements, where I want the light to stream in and be baked as such. Therefore, by the end of the video, I'm going to completely abandon how I do this, where I'm just making flat planes, and instead everything is going to be composed of elements that are 1/2 meter wide, and then whatever length and width and so forth is necessary. Once again, I'm changing how the room is laid out because I'm trying to make space for the different assets the students have put together. Once again, this is a combination of multiple forms of reference material. I'm not exactly sure how this is going to look at the end, but what's important is to kind of throw everything out on the table for the person we're working with to come in and say what does and doesn't actually work. Ran into several problems where my export settings at some point during this project were completely wrong. And I'm bringing in objects, so you'll notice the scale on the side is actually 0.01. Don't like that, don't want that. I need all of my elements to actually be a scale of 1. So that was me trying to go through and fix things. Now, I do take a few liberties. Instead of trying to fix all of the students' assets, I do go in there and do tweak the scales manually. You just saw a bunch of different assets that pretty much, I believe the project was due on a Tuesday, and that was a list of things that Thursday that needed to be created to kind of fill out the different areas. I noticed some weirdness on the UVs of the curtain inside of Substance Painter. It looked like a single polygon had something wrong with it. So here I'm bringing those in. I'm also rescaling them. I'm just trying to see if I can fix that problem. You'll notice how crude the geometry is, and that's because I believe the student went in and just used a standard reduction function on side of that object. Instead of what I really would have liked to have done, I should have asked the student for the high-res version and then brought that in ZBrush and used ZBrush's decimation techniques, because that seems to be a lot better than what we are getting out of Blender's method of decimation. Once again, just going through here, checking to see whether or not that seam still exists, and it seems to have been a UV issue. So now that I've flipped things around and made things right, everything's working just fine. And of course, I'm getting taking a little bit too long on adjusting these different parameters, trying to get something that actually looks right. It's a little too blue, a little too purple actually, so I changed that and re-export this asset out and bring it into the scene. And that's all that's really necessary to make that work. Now we're going to take that object, the curtain, place it on the sides of the windows, and I do scale it in the negative x-axis to duplicate it across the axis so that they kind of mirror each other. Noticing a lot of problems with the scale, and that's just because I'm not paying attention to my unit setup. Instead, basically everything's halved from what I expect. That's a quick fix, just re-export it out, try to get all my units correct. Usual process, just applying all the materials to everything, and now I'm going to create a prefab of that curtain element called window curtains, and I'm going to place that on each window. I could have included that prefab inside of the window if I wanted to. Oh, what I'm doing there is I didn't center up my object so that the game object, that is the prefab, was centered. I'd screwed all that up, so I had to redo all that stuff. Now we're just going to take that different object, and here I'm playing around with the different dishes and so forth that are going to be on the tables. I decided to make a prefab of it so that the things, I don't have, hundreds of objects just floating in my scene hierarchy, and I can, basically get rid of them if necessary. Once again, I'm playing around with the scale problem. I'm checking out what the dimensions of a spoon should actually be, but modeling in that coordinate system is just too small given the fact that I'm in meters mode. So I go ahead and I just scale that thing up to several meters large, giant spoon. And now I'm playing around with making the spoon. This is, what is this, 10? This is very early in the morning on the 18th. So I'm kind of not into modeling mode yet. So I take a little bit more time than I would have expected to make a simple object like a spoon. I seem to struggle a little bit with figuring out the general shape. It's a little bit too round, but I play with that enough to get something that's somewhat good enough. And actually go through a lot of steps on this spoon that don't make sense in retrospect, but it's fine. You can see me struggling with this damn shape over and over again, and I have no idea why. Once again, it's just too early in the morning. Make some cuts, reduce the geometry down by using the scale tool, realign everything, and just get something that looks kind of like the flow of a natural spoon. Not too happy with that line, the bevel on the end that I did. That kind of screws up the geometry a little bit, but it's all right. Doesn't do much. The spoons don't. What are we at right now? We're at 500 or 200 verts right now, which is a little extreme for a spoon. I could probably reduce that down to maybe half that if necessary. But what I am going to do is, after adjusting the pivot point and so forth, I get this strange idea that, hey, maybe I want to try to bring this in a ZBrush and make some sort of pattern on the spoon. Of course, I see some issues with the geometry there, so I'm going to go ahead and make a cut and make sure that that's all triangulated and quadrangulated just properly. Once that's done, we're going to bring it back into ZBrush and make sure that looks properly. And everything's working just fine. And then I just decide, let's just first start smoothing this thing out and making it a little bit nicer. And here's where I'm looking at some of the different reference material. I've noticed sort of like a flowery pattern going up the spoon. And yeah, I don't know what I'm doing here. I'm adjusting lazy mouse to try to see to get a straighter line as I'm going down this object. And my first thought was I'll use a mask here and just mask out an area where I want this thing to actually be pushed in or raised out. And once again, I just kind of think to myself, it's a spoon. You're probably not even going to notice this darn thing. And as far as I'm concerned, you're not going to be picking it up or doing anything with it. So screw it. I'm just going to export it out at maybe a few thousand polys, bring that into Substance Painter and use it as part of the bake instead of doing anything terribly complicated. Now, I forgot to set up the UVs before then, so I go back into Maya and I cut this object up for a front side and a back side. I probably could have cut the head of the spoon off and then it would have helped out a lot more with the UVs because it's only taking up a small amount of space. But in the back of my head, I say, you know what? When I create this asset in the future, if I make a fork and a knife, I'll just have them all using the same material in the same textures, and that'll use up all the necessary space. Here we're adding a little bit of grunge. This is still not post our first meeting, which is going to change significantly everything about how I'm going to go into this project. But for right now, I'm just adding a little bit of dirt and grit. And the interesting thing that I notice is when we do have our first meeting is it doesn't matter how much dirt and grit you actually have, just walking into the space and seeing it in color and seeing it vibrant and so forth is enough to make people go like, well, this is too beautiful. What's going on here? Even though when you zoom in, there's dirt, there's crap on the walls, there's, all kinds of junk everywhere. And one of the things that I have to not fight, but overcome really is this perception of how it's supposed to look. And I'm going to get a lot more feedback later next week on that when I meet with one of the project leads who went to a conference and showed off the video that you'll see at the end of this of just us walking through it, and got a lot of feedback about visually how they would expect it to look. So that's probably going to really shift everything you see in the future. Now I need some sort of sacks of flour. They're doing a soup, and what I was told is the soup is basically a thickened water. It maybe has potato and it's starchy, but it's also a little runny. And I figured, flour is probably one of the things is typically an additive you put in most things just to thicken things up. So they'll probably have sacks of flour. Once again, this is actually not in any of the reference material I saw. This is just us, extrapolating at this point, adding something that you would expect to be in a kitchen. And since they are serving so many people, they would probably have giant sacks of flour. I make two different versions, one that's open, one that's closed. I have to say I'm not 100% happy with how this looks. This is definitely a mesh that I should bring in a ZBrush and add some more waviness to and fabric patterns. But once again, this is the 18th and we're already at noon, and I meet with the students in about 45 minutes to discuss the project, and I wanted to get some of this stuff done before they walk in so we knew where we were at and I could ask them to put different parts together. Usual stuff, making materials, duplicating them. I'm separating them enough so that when I bring the two into Substance Painter, the occlusion mapping doesn't have any, crisscross between the two assets so that they don't darken next to each other. I find sort of like a sacky type color here, and I'm playing around with the different ones. This in particular, this cotton one, I'm not really a fan of at first, but I play with the different, the amount of normal information, the amount of height, and still not terribly happy. So now I'm going through and trying to see if there's no kinds of food on Substance Source. So this is actually an area where I think someone could go in there and make a lot of cool assets and make some money. So what I do is I just find a picture of flour. In Photoshop, I'm trying to get rid of the lights and the darks by inverting the image, blurring it, and then using a soft light on top of it. And there you can see, then I offset it to check out the corners of the object. This is the kind of the old school way that you would do this stuff. I know that in Alchemist now I can take that and throw it in here and then use one of the advanced tiling generators on it. But I like to take a little bit of time in Photoshop beforehand, because that way I just feel like I have more control and I can try to clean up a lot of the problems before giving it to Substance Alchemist, and then it just makes Substance Alchemist's life a lot easier to work with that. Here I'm taking the flower texture, I'm duplicating it. If anything, the normals in the height is a little too intense, but that's something we can definitely dial back just by reducing the opacity of those particular layers. Here I'm trying to add some sort of, it needs something. It's lacking depth, it's lacking real structure as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't have anything definitive about it. There I was looking up the Polish word for flower and it's maca, but the problem is that Substance Painter doesn't seem to accept a lot of the different symbols that are necessary to make it work. I'll probably need to choose a different kind of font. If anything, I will probably go into Photoshop and make different stencils in Polish in the future, or Yiddish, or I believe it's Polish primarily, that's the spoken language, so I'll probably do that. But there, I look online for some reference. Here I'm adding some kind of like a seam to the sides where it was sewn together. It's a little extreme. I could probably make it smaller, but once again, if I make it smaller, one, the texture is probably not going to be prominent enough on the surface, and two, you probably won't even notice it. And so things have to be exaggerated a little bit to make them just notable, something that you actually notice in the scene. Here I'm playing around with trying to see if any of these different brushes will add any information, and I just decided, let's just add a generic kind of dirt to it using one of the brushes, the alpha maps. Nothing particular, just, it's been on the floor, it's a sack of flour, it's probably been thrown around a little bit, so just something to darken up the colors and give it a little bit of something. It's missing something, and I don't know how to describe it better. It's just when you look at it, you know something's wrong. Here we're bringing these elements now into the scene, so we're going to bring those sacks of flour in. You'll notice I haven't done a light bake in a little bit. I turned the automatic baking off because there are so many assets in the scene at this point that it takes up to 15 or 30 minutes to bake everything out. So all that stuff gets disabled. We'll go ahead and bring our sacks in, set up their materials. Of course, I have 2 materials for some reason, so I need to fix that. I'm not sure what's going on there. Assign all the different textures to the different areas. The scale is way off, way too big. I mean, these sacks are the size of people at first, so I shrink them down to at least about half their size. And then the idea is that this is the corner of the kitchen where food preparation is going on. There's some closed sacks of flour in the corner over here. We just rotate them around until it looks kind of nice. Something like they just threw them over there. And then there's an open one next to the actual oven where people can readily grab this. Now we need to make some rolls because that's one of the other elements that's prominent in the material that we're using, specifically the video footage, as well as I believe there's also some pictures of it in the actual real reference material that we're using. But bread's pretty easy. I mean, it's just a loaf, so I'm just kind of pulling stuff. I take it, I cut it in half, and then I make a sliced version of that bread, which you're seeing here. So just lots of playing, getting the scale stuff right, assigning materials. Then we're going to bring this into Substance Painter, and this is kind of more of a pain in the rear for me to put together. The reason for that is because there's nothing on Substance Alchemist, so I'm going to have to use my old skill sets to kind of put some textures on this surface, make things look right. I'm still not very competent in doing this without using materials that have already been created. That's an area that I'm definitely going to have to spend time developing in the next few months, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot more assets we have to create from the ground up. Another thing you'll notice is that I used OpenGL, and all the research I did seems to say that when you're using Unity, you should be using the OpenGL format for exporting things out, and I've been using DirectX before that. So if you've seen that, yes, you were right, and I was wrong. Going in here now, trying to create the inner part of the bread and the outer part of the bread as separate materials. Not 100% happy with how this goes. Me stretching it out right there kind of is ridiculous. Once again, I use that same technique I was talking about before where I'm trying to get rid of the lighting of the scene by using the soft layer. Here, I'm offsetting it again, and not too bad this time. There's a little bit of some like desaturation going on the right side, but otherwise it's fine. Now I'm trying to find a picture where I can lift the surface up. When I look at this one, I'm like, nah, there's too much lighting going on with that one. So I just look around for basic pieces of bread. Here's someone that took one of their bread coming out. And yes, it does have a highlight on it, but it's high enough resolution and there's enough information that I figured I could work with it. Just trying to get rid of any background information that's going to make things not work. Going through now using the heel brush to try to merge these different loaves together. Maybe not the best thing to have done, but once again, it's 1:06 p.m. and I'm desperately trying to get this done as fast as possible. All right, so now we've got our bread, and there's some problems with it, but it does tile okay. And what I'm trying to tell myself in my head is, this is the albedo channel. It's not the diffuse channel. Don't worry about if it looks too flat. You're not supposed to have any lighting information anyway. So here I'm playing around with the bread one beforehand, making some adjustments to see if any of it looks good. It looks fine for the roll inside, so I go ahead and export it. Once again, if anything, the normal intensity and the height intensity is just a little bit too much. Here in particular though, everything's inverted, so I make sure I go through there and I invert the height so that it looks like it's puffing outwards and not going inside of the object. Now I've got those two materials done, we go ahead and import them into Substance Painter. And once they're imported, I go ahead and apply them. And I'm not 100% happy with how they look. One, they look too saturated, so that is something I will fix. I also want to have some sort of a transition between the inside and outside that bread naturally has. So I will go in there and paint around the edges and make sure that things look okay. The painting at first is going to be a little excessive. And here I'm actually dialing back the, I believe, probably the metallicity or the glossiness of the object. It just seems a little bit too intense. Same thing with the normals. Now we're adding that top back on there. And here I'm going to just paint around the edges. And I'm not doing a very good job at first. It looks like someone just drew crayon. But then what I do is I go in and I use the push tool to actually push it back outwards or pull it back inwards. So there's a more natural sort of change from the outside to the inside. Here I'm now going to play around with dialing back the saturation. It's just too intense, so I'm kind of making it a little bit more gray, a little bit more brownish, as opposed to having those oranges and reds in there, which just don't look right. Got a little bit of a seam problem going on with that object, and I think I fixed that by eventually changing it over to being projected as opposed to just a UV space. Now I've got everything done, we're going to export this out, and we're going to bring it into Unity. Now everything's in Unity, so we're going to start placing our different objects. We've got our potato over there, and one thing that I wanted to do was to make sure that these look distinct enough from potatoes, because they are just brown lumps. And I think they do look somewhat different than a potato, so everything works out. If anything, I might need to go in there and adjust the material properties a little bit. It looks maybe a little bit too shiny, but then again, the outer surface of bread usually does look a little shiny. Now we need a container, some sort of a vessel that's going to hold all the bread that's being taken around from place to place, from person to person. So I go ahead and create a general oval type vessel. We're going to add some little pull-out areas on the sides where there are going to be handles that the person can pick up. In some of the shots, it looks like there's copper on the handles. So we go ahead and I'm going to make those separate with the UV so that I can apply copper to them. Here are the handles, I make separate objects rather than messing around with trying to extrude what's already there and using, a curve tool or whatnot, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work that great. This seems to work just fine. I just kind of shove it in there and make it work. The idea is, of course, that these are probably going to be bolted on using like a screw or something anyway, so it should be fine. Going to need to fix a few things. We're going to mirror this over to the other side. I don't know why, but whatever changes they made to the mirror tool several years ago, I just hate, and I've just never gotten quite used to it. Okay, we're going to go ahead and use the same technique I did with the potatoes, where I just put a bunch of pieces of bread in there. The idea is that I'm going to have just 2 layers of bread with these randomly kind of oriented in different ways, and then underneath that, we're just going to put a bread texture. You probably won't ever get to see it, so it should be fine. Here we're making a cut on the inside. I'm going to then cut out everything on the bottom and then just put a flat plane in there where I'll just put a general bread texture. And of course, yes, I did think about how can I bring this into ZBrush. And then there's a technique in ZBrush that I can't remember how to do, where you bring in an object and it becomes like an instance, and then you can paint the object on the surface and then orient them after the fact in different directions. I know you can do it. It's just been so long since I've done it that I can't remember. So I just decide, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to make several pieces of these breads, and yeah, I'm not going to waste my time trying to get it to work because I don't have a lot of time. I've got to meet with the students in the next day and get all this done as fast as possible. Okay, so handles, usual UV stuff, just relaxing the different parts where it comes together and laying them out. Laying out's okay, it's not great. If anything, I could have reduced the amount of UV space the bottom of this thing takes up because you'll probably never see it, but it's okay. I screwed up there, and you'll notice I set it to be DirectX and not OpenGL. That's a problem. Bake everything, bring our assets in, make sure it's projection instead of just UV space so that it gets rid of those horrible seams you saw on the side. Go ahead and add copper. Now, before I finish this, I will screw this up. It still looks bad. There's too much reflection going on, too much metallicity on the surface of this object, even after I add the rust to kind of dial that back down, because when we bring it into Unity shortly, you're going to notice it's reflecting everything in the reflection probe in the scene, and it looks horrible compared to everything else. So that's one thing I will go back and change at some point once I have time. Here we're adding those little bolts, the little screw holes on the sides of it. And here I'm fighting with the ambient occlusion thing. I need to undo that, so I go ahead and fix that. Now we are bringing everything over into Unity. This is the Get Real 3D plugin that I'm bringing in. This is what allows Unity to work across a distributed cluster in VR mode, basically. And that is what works for our 10-sided cave system. So now I'm adding a body and a camera, similar to what you would do for a Vive or an Oculus. The body is, of course, the central, the floor of the object, the feet. The head is going to be attached to some sort of a sensor that's used, in our case, by an ART sensor that determines your location in the scene when you walk around. There I was also adding a script I wrote a long time ago for just general movement using our Get Real stuff in an Xbox controller. The interesting thing is that it doesn't matter, none of this is going to work. This week, we also happened to move our entire cave system over to Camden, and the two caves were networked together so that we could do some interesting projects with the FAA. And when we took them apart, some of the networking cable got disconnected. And because of that, the entire 10-sided cave system doesn't work, so I have to rapidly come up with a solution the next day before our meeting. And actually, it is the next day because it's 9:19 at this point, and I believe that's when we were meeting to discuss the progress of the project. So actually, what I'm doing now is I have until 12:30 to not only finish all these assets, get them in there, do a rebake, and put it onto our cave system before the other project lead is going to come in. The other project lead is in sociology and in Holocaust in general. That's their background. So they are providing the more historically accurate information that we need. And this is our first time showing that person what we've put together over the last several weeks. So it's kind of critical that I get things to work. Unfortunately, I'm unable to get it to work in our VR system in 3D. So I end up, I can't even get the VR system work because network cabling has been disconnected, and I just don't have the time between 12:30 and between 10:30 right now, which I'm still working on this scene, and 12:30 to get it all working. So instead, we have another node that has several Quadro graphics cards in it that can push out, 1920 by 10,800 pixels to 10 screens wide of data. And I load Unity up on there, and I just load the project up in the editor, and we fly through it inside the editor to try to save the day so that we can show off what's going on. The cool thing about doing it in the editor as well is it allowed me to change things in real time as I was given feedback so that we could make it somewhat better for the person. Now here, I've gotten tired of creating the stupid little cubes and trying to block off lighting that's streaming through these windows. So I decide to go in and create the back sides of these windows, which get exported out as a separate element for each one and attached to it. The idea being you'll never see this, it's just there to make the light baking easier. So it provides a natural break from one side to the other. As you can see there, there's nothing, the light's just streaming straight through. So we bring that object in, I'm going to make it part of that prefab, and all this work is going to be thrown away very soon. The reason for that is because after our meeting, the light baking is being such a pain in the rear, and trying to set up all these different objects that stop the light come through is such a pain that I'm just going to make all walls double-sided, and they're all going to be 0.5 meters thick, and that's just the way I'm going to do it from here on out. But we haven't gotten there yet. But this is the lead up to being frustrated enough with working in this way to not want it to happen anymore. So there we go. Everything's working out, bringing in those different assets, making it part of the prefab, and having it just automatically distribute across all those different objects. Checking my grid, things are a little bit too thick, so I'm going through and making sure they all line up just fine, and everything seems to work okay, so that's all fine. So here the tops and bottoms are missing, so I'm extruding those elements out to reconnect to the other side. This way they also naturally block the light, and I'm hoping the light bake will come out to be a little bit better and require less fine tuning on my end to make sure things look right, and not have to add blocking, just bogus elements in there to help block out light. So Maya there crashed and I lost all my work, so now I'm going back through and I had to. And luckily, this is one of the good reasons why working off a Google Drive is nice, even though it slows everything down and updating can be slow. But I was able to go back and find a previous version of the scene from like 30 minutes ago that I had saved to the drive and load that one up instead. There you can see it right there. That's the actual failure. So I'm going through, accessing my drive, downloading the latest version I can find of it that will actually work. And this actually fails several times. For whatever reason, the latest version of the drive one is 0 bytes in size. So I have to go back several iterations on that particular file until I find one that works. There we go, finally find one, labeled some weird temporary file, and I'm able to get back to work. Now I'm doing the same thing I did for the windows to the walls. Once again, this is where I've gotten to the point where I'm going to just make light baking a lot easier for me. You'll notice the date is 9/20 at this point. We've already had our review session, and getting the lighting to just be easier to work with is one of the big things that I got out of it. The other big thing that I got out of our session was the response from the person we're working with is, it's just too beautiful. It just looks too good. And that's when we went into the post-processing stack, and I explained that we are creating the assets kind of neutral in mind. And it's going to be the post-processing stack that's going to be applied that will change sort of your understanding of how the scene looks. So then we went in there and we dialed back the saturation, dialed back the bloom, increased the ambient occlusion that gets generated in real time, and the scene became much more somber. And they liked that a lot better, but at the same time, I made sure to explain that there are very distinct pictures of what this place looked like. There's the kitchen where they were working every day, and some of the kitchens were dirtier than others, but a lot of them were more clean. But then there were areas where things were just completely in disarray. And we decided to come up with the idea that we would juxtapose these two by creating a hallway. And before I decided to start making this hallway, this is where I'm bringing the different assets, the different prefabs of different sizes with the front and backs and the sides to make light baking easier. And I'm going to go and replace all the different elements in here with those ones so that the light bake works a little bit better. I'm also working on this because she is going to a conference next week. The 20th is probably like a Friday or Saturday, right? And I'm working on this, and I want to get a video out to her, which is the same one that I posted on the YouTube channel, so that she can show it off and get more feedback from other experts in this field. Because once again, I know nothing about this event, or historically I know very little other than what was generally taught in school. And quite frankly, I don't even think I learned very much about the ghetto in Warsaw at all. It was always about Hitler and everything else. So my knowledge is incredibly limited, and we're using all these experts we're using the experts to say yes or no to things. And it's very important that we get all this feedback so that we're making the right choices. Here is the first time where I'm going through now and I'm replacing those flat single planed objects with the full half-meter sized ones instead. Another small tweak that just happened there is I'm reducing the size of the room. The room felt too large, like it could fit too many people, and in the reference material, it was much more crowded and cramped. So I reduced the size of the room probably by about 6 feet, or around 2 meters roughly. Here we're playing around with the backsides, and I'm just going and replacing all of the elements with these other ones that we just created. Now it's not perfect. You'll notice that, based upon the scaling and the size, things are a little off here and there. And that's when I will have to go in there and do some special tweaking. But for the most part, this does drastically simplify the light baking process. And it doesn't require that I go through and spend tons of time putting in light blockers in different areas. That's another problem, is the columns are still transparent on the top and the bottom, which will let light streak through them. So I am going to go and fix that shortly as well. Slightly changing the layout as well. I need to make room for a door over there now, and this is where the hallway is. Well, that's close to where the hallway is going to end up being. So you can see that hallway that I started to put in there. Now we're fixing the columns so that light doesn't leak through. I take a little bit of time just to make sure the geometry is clean. I've got time now, the meeting's done, so I might as well make sure things are going to work properly for us in the future. Now this is the 1x1 column. I'm also going to take this column and stretch it out to the 2x2 as well. There we are, there's a 2x2 column, and I just go in there and stretch out the UVs uniformly across the entire thing so it takes up the full space. For some reason, some of them get replaced properly and other ones don't, so I do have to go in there and fix them. We're doing a search here, isolating the different elements, deleting the ones that don't matter, and bringing in the correct new versions of them, the 1x1 and the 2x2 pillars. Everything looks pretty good, so I'm relatively happy with it. Now I'm going through and recreating that hallway, adding those different elements. The hallway is going to have rooms on the sides that you walk through, and the rooms are going to be in disrepair, so that you get kind of hit with, just you get a contrast to the soup kitchen itself, where things are cleaner and people are actually living. Now I'm making the doors to let you move from room to room. I have to look up the general size. I don't know this stuff off the top of my head. Go ahead and create those doors, bevel them a little bit, because why not? Got plenty of polys to sling around here. I make the different size doors. We make a 5x5, a 4x4, and I believe that's it. We don't do a 3x5 in this case. Now I want to go through and fix the UVs. In doing the UV fixing, I also have to go through and tweak the polys to add some seams here and there, just to make the UV unwrapping a little bit easier. Now, I'm not going to recreate textures for these. In fact, there are going to be overlapping textures, which means I'm going to need to go inside of Unity and make sure that Unity automatically creates lighting UVs for these different objects where they don't have overlapping UVs, so that when it does bake things out, it's got free space to draw all the lighting information on the texture. But for all these objects, because they're all being pulled from materials that are just a 5x5 or a 0 to 1 space in the UVs, I don't need to do anything really special for this stuff. I just throw them down. It doesn't really matter where they're sampling from, so long as they're just sampling the same scale and everything that everything else is. So here's the final version, slowed down ever so slightly, that I submitted. The top part is the more somber version of it. The bottom part is where I cranked up the bloom and the lighting and made it more towards a golden hour, so that things looked a little bit more vibrant. And this is what was actually shown off to, or at least I didn't show it, but my colleague did at their conference to get feedback. Obviously, this is incredibly early in this project, so any feedback now is better than later. But because most of this is being done with the post-processing stack, it's not like it really requires me to change anything. There you can see those bread bins over there and how highly reflective they are. Like I said, that's bad. That's incredibly bad. Those need to get fixed so they don't look like that. They need to be definitely tarnished a lot. Here we move off into the other area, going past the different elements. You'll notice there are lots of difference in the lighting here. Shadows on the top part are there, whereas the shadows on the bottom part are not there. I took out one of the lights in the scene and tried to allow lighting from the windows to really set the stage for everything. And that's pretty much it. So I will see you all next time. I already have a lot of work that's already gone into this project, new stuff to do. And yeah, so long everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.